Hello and welcome to the Native Landscape Certification Program Level 1 Plant Walk. Today you're going to hear about some great plants to use in your landscape and also some nasty invasive plants you want to be sure you don't have in your landscape.
Welcome. My name is Bruce Ballingy. I'm a member of the Native Plant Society of Texas, Native Prairies Association, a master naturalist. I serve on the stewardship board of the Dogwood Canyon Audubon Center and a friend of Cedar Ridge Preserve. Kind of got my fingers into all sorts of little pieces of plant pie around the area here. So I hope you enjoy this tour.
Hello, I'm Nancy Griswold. I'm a member of the Native Plant Society. I'm a master gardener and I'm a master naturalist. And I'm going to spend some time talking to you about all the great plants on your list.
Hello, my name is Nancy Nance. I'm a Dallas County Master Gardener and a member of the Texas Native Plant Society. I volunteer at both Texas Discovery Gardens and the Dallas Arboretum.
Hi, I'm Nancy Wilson. I am a member of the Dallas chapter of the Native Plant Society of Texas. I'm also a Dallas County Master Gardener and a North Texas Master Naturalist. I started learning about native plants in 1998 and I have been experimenting in this yard ever since. I'm delighted that a number of the level 1 plants are growing here for you to see how they might grow in your landscape.
I'm standing in front of a beautiful cedar elm tree. This is again one of the best landscaping plants we have available to us, or landscaping trees. It's a little bit smaller than some of those we've looked at today. Its height is typically somewhere between 30 and 60 feet. It's very easy to identify. The tree has very small leaves and they're very have a sandpapery feel to them. If you take one of the small leaves and rub it against the grain, it feels exactly like sandpaper. The good thing about this tree, one of the good things about it, is it's a deciduous tree. The trees turn a beautiful yellow color in the fall. A couple of other great things, they are so small you don't have to blow them, rake them up. You can just actually leave them where they are and they kind of melt into the compost themselves and sort of melt into the soil around the tree. I, on the other hand, take the time to rake them up and put them in my compost pile because they decompose so quickly that I have lots of good stuff in my compost pile for next spring. It is an easy tree to grow. It's easily transplanted. And if you can look at it, it has a very upright stance to it. So it's not one of those trees where you have to do some trimming on either side of it. As it's growing, it has a very upright growth to it and a sort of a narrow crown that's makes the tree, I think, look very good.
This is the bur oak. It's Quercus macrocarpa. I love that name, macrocarpa, because it has these enormous leaves. It has the world's largest acorn. It's just the coolest tree. Now this one was planted in the spring of 2019. We planted a seedling here. We wanted to show all these plants as they were used in people's yards. But the problem is I looked all around. I haven't seen anybody planting this in their yard. And I think one of the problems is these acorns get so big. If you plant them near your driveway, you're going to be able to dent your car up with it. So I just hope we see more of these. It's a marvelous tree. When I was in the Master Gardener School, Dr. Greg Church talked about all the bad things that could happen to trees, all the bad, like cankers and insect invasions and galls, all these bad things that happen to trees. And so I finally at the end of the class said, so do you really like any trees? I mean, what's your favorite? Do you have a favorite tree? And he says, yes, I love the bur oak and I can understand why. This is just a great tree. Another thing I wanted to tell you about was that this tree was planted through the Texas Tree Foundation. They have a tree planting initiatives. They've been going around the city planting these in parkways and at schools and in public areas. And if you ever hear about this through your neighborhood association, that's how I heard about it. It's a really fun day. It's a fun way to spend the day. They come in and they have the holes drilled. They have an auger that drills all these holes. So your job is just to go ahead and the fun part, put the tree in, we put the dirt back in around it, and we put mulch on the top. So we planted 50 trees in probably half a day down here, and it's just such an improvement to the park. We'd lost so many trees recently with storm damage, and then the drought a few years ago. All these trees started coming down once they were damaged that we didn't see until maybe 2 or 3 years later, and then all of a sudden all these big trees started toppling. So it's just such a relief to have 50 brand new trees down here. They also planted 50 over at Flagpole Hill, so look for them. The Texas Tree Foundation. This is a chinkapin oak. It's in the white oak family. Although the leaves are serrated, there aren't any bristles, and that's how you know it's in the white oak family. This tree is one of the great trees throughout Texas. It gets really big. You can see they get to be about 100 to 110 feet tall and about 50 feet wide. When we first moved here, I thought, oh no, there's going to be acorns all over the ground that'll have to be cleaned up daily. And there weren't any. And so what I found out is that trees, a lot of times the acorns come every 3 to 5 years. And what it is that these acorns are so nutritious that as soon as they're on the ground, they get gobbled up by all the squirrels and birds. And when I read about this tree, what I found out is these acorns really are appreciated by all the acorn eaters. Now, on the other side of it, I also heard that white oak acorns pretty much germinate almost immediately, sometimes even in the tree. And when you see them on the ground, a lot of times you don't know that it's germinated because it starts out in the winter by growing roots, and then you won't see a leaf until spring. And because they germinate so quickly, they are not preferred for storage by the squirrels. The squirrels like the red oak acorns because they don't germinate for as much as a year, and so they can bury those away and know that they're still going to be good next year, unlike the white oak. So this is a live oak tree, and it's a gorgeous tree it grows all the way through from the Atlantic down through southeast Virginia, along the Atlantic states, through the Gulf Coast, all the way over to California. So this tree is pretty widespread. It's called the live oak because it's evergreen. It loses leaves about here in Dallas. About the end of February, it starts dropping leaves, and it'll drop them for a couple weeks through most of March. So but essentially it's alive. It stays green all year long, which is different than a lot of oaks around here. It has a really deep taproot, and it doesn't get very tall. So 50 to 60 feet tall versus some of the other oaks that get 100, 110 feet tall. And because it has a deep root and it doesn't get very tall, it's pretty sturdy. It doesn't really suffer from wind damage. That's why some of the most famous trees around here are live oaks. They live a long time. There's some that live to be 900 to 1,000 years old. There's one in Goose Island, and it's 1,000 years old. There's one in College Station that was planted in 1891, so it's a mere youngster in comparison. But the live oaks sequester a lot of carbon because they live a long time. Now, the trees get only 50 to 60 feet tall, but they can have the limbs can expand out to 150 feet tall. So that's why they're this gracious, beautiful tree. They swoop down and then come back up again. And like the other oaks, it's a great wildlife nature plant. It produces acorns for all those acorn lovers, and it also provides habitat for butterflies and moths. So it does a lot of good things for our environment.
I'm standing in front of a beautiful Shumard red oak. It's one of our best landscaping trees because it provides beautiful color all year round. It's a large tree, grows to as much as 120 feet and about 50 to 60 feet across. So we're talking a substantial tree which will need plenty of room in your landscape. The one kind of unique thing about this tree is it has a very open canopy, as you'll see from the tree behind me. Many trees, to get that look, you'll have to have someone come out and trim your trees, but this one does it all by itself. It's just a very pretty, very rounded looking tree. This is a very easy tree to identify. Its leaves are very deeply lobed. Aren't too many other trees like this. It also produces acorns. They're small, about 3/4 of an inch to an inch long, and of course people either hate or love those acorns. Yes, last year was a banner year, and it looks like this year is going to be just as big if these trees around us they're already filled with those small acorns. The plant, this is of course a deciduous tree. Its leaves will turn red in the fall, and this particular tree, definitely you have to have some be prepared to do some leaf raking or some leaf blowing, one or another, to get rid of the leaves. But it's well worth it. It's an absolutely beautiful tree. I'm standing in front of a beautiful pecan tree. It's a wonderful addition to your home garden, but be sure and give them plenty of room. They grow into very large, majestic trees, much like this one has. They can grow up to an average of 100 to 160 feet in height, branch spread anywhere from 60 to 75 feet. Another fact about them, they are the official state trees of the state of Texas. They're a species of hickory native to northern Mexico and the southern U.S. Particularly, they grow in Texas and in Georgia. There's an old wives' tale that says pecan trees can forecast the weather. I don't know what this dates back to, but many people, especially who are big-time gardeners, go by the pecan tree. They say that spring has officially arrived when the pecan tree starts branching out. I can't verify the validity of that, but that's what they say. The pecan is normally one of the last trees to get its leaves, and it's one of the first trees to lose its leaves. So there may be something to be said about that. They are deciduous trees. They grow very quickly after the first couple of years. With all fruit-producing trees, you do have to take good care of them. They are susceptible to various diseases, and they attract various pests as well. But they give us these wonderful pecan nuts, which of course we love, and all those dessert goodies that we all like to eat. One other interesting thing, they can live as long as 300 years. And I have a very good example for you. At the Dallas Arboretum, there's a pecan tree we call the Constitution pecan. It has been officially dated. The tree was alive when the Constitution was signed. Now, it's been a while since I've had history, so I looked that up. The U.S. Constitution was signed officially in 1787. So if my math is right, that tree is 233 years old, which is truly amazing, and it still provides nuts and produces fruit every year.
This is a desert willow. There's two great examples of desert willow here. This is not a real willow. It's in the catalpa family, and I don't know if you're familiar with the catalpa, but it gets really big and it has these enormous seed pods. This plant doesn't get more than 15 to 40 feet tall, and it also has the same seed pods like the catalpa, big, long, thin seed pods. It's fast growing. It takes 2 to 3 years to get about this big, and during that beginning time you can go in and either shape it into a single stem, or you can allow more than one trunk to come up. It depends on where you have it and what you want out of it. But usually in the first 2 to 3 years is the time that you limb it up or let it sprawl. It's a deciduous tree, and it produces light shade, so you can go ahead and plant all your sun-loving plants. Like you see that they've got their yuccas underneath and their Texas sage, it's not going to shade anything out. It'll have lots of light underneath. Oh, it's a great plant for all kinds of butterflies and hummingbirds, and it provides the seed pods are good for birds. It's a larval host to the white-winged moth. We have one of these desert willows at the bathhouse garden, and this plant loves dry feet and it loves dry soil. It really doesn't need much water. When we first planted it, I went down there with a water meter every day, well, every couple of days, to make sure that we were going to be able to get it through its first summer. But with the water meter, it always showed fine. It never needed water. And Janet Smith kept reminding me it's called desert willow. And it's called desert willow for a good reason. It just doesn't need water. But on the other side of it, there's been several really bad floods at White Rock Lake since we planted it. Days where the water stayed right over the top of the planter for 2 or 3 days, and that plant has survived the flood water, which we're all amazed at. Just like the trumpet vine and the catalpa tree, it has these beautiful orchid-shaped flowers. They're just lovely.
All right, I'm standing in front now of what's called an eaves necklace, something that most people are not familiar with, but it's really one of our very nice landscape trees. The planting behind me, I think, is the best way to display these trees. If you do them singly, they can be somewhat spindly looking, to be kind. But if you do a group planting, they really look very nice, as you can tell. It's an unusual tree, I think, because of the leaves that it has. They're very bright green leaflets. It's a deciduous tree, so these come out in spring. They have a very beautiful bloom. It's kind of like a wisteria blossom, white with sort of a pink center to it. So those flowers eventually, of course, turn to seeds, and those seeds are where the name Eve's necklace comes from. They turn a very dark, almost black color on the plant, and they hang on sort of an axis, about 6 to 9 of these on an axis, so it looks just like a string of pearls, hence the name.
Here's an example of the Yapon holly. It is a northern ornamental tree or shrub. In this case, it's not particularly large. It's not old enough to have berries yet. This was grown from a berry, probably dropped by a bird, here in the yard, and I'm just allowing it to come on up. You can see it's surrounded by American beautyberry, and a white oak is behind and overhead. It's doing quite well in this fairly shady spot, shade to part shade. You know, it's one of those, it's a very interesting plant in that its name is Ilex vomitoria because traders did not want people consuming the berries for its caffeine. This is the most caffeinated plant in North America, and you can actually make tea with it. You can now buy it, in fact, but by calling it vomitoria, that discouraged people from drinking it and competing against coffee. So the story goes. Anyway, it's one of those interesting stories out there. It can have red to orange berries when it gets to, when it gets to that point. And of course, you might see it in a lot of landscapes. It's very popular because it's very trainable, very shapeable. You can generally trim it to different kinds of shapes that you want. In this case, we're just seeing that first trunk come up and the first branching come off. It can be confused with some other non-native plants like privet, but a good way to tell the difference is that privet has a completely rounded, smooth edge, and you can see the yapon has a little bit of an edge to it, serration, modulations in it, and that's the best way to tell. It's like privet, it's evergreen, which makes it, of course, very popular in landscapes. Here's a Mexican plum. You can see that it's got very dark branches, very dark bark, and these leaves that are fairly thickly and rough. And the easiest way to identify the Mexican plum is by looking at its bark, and the best bark is going to be along the trunk. All right, now here we are at the trunk. the same Mexican plum. We were standing outside before. As you can see, the bark's very rough. And if you come in here close, you can see that the bark has exposed the underlying surface and it's kind of peeling off. That's a great telltale sign that what you're looking at is a Mexican plum. This one's quite old. It was here when we bought the property about 20 years ago. You can see some other smaller ones that we planted, and you can see they're doing quite well. And so these kind of all three ornamental trees are doing very nicely under some older, larger trees. And underneath, you can see where Turk's cap has kind of spread out from a small bed over the time and taken advantage of the shade, mixed in with some Virginia creeper, American climbing vine, and a little bit of chitterwood coming up over here. I'll have to deal with that at some point. Here's an eastern redbud. This is another good understory tree. It's, of course, height of summer now. It's a spring bloomer, so we don't see any flowers. They're actually quite good in salad. We can see, I don't know if we can get close enough to it, there are a few seeds left, seed pods left that haven't quite fallen off yet. Pretty hard, just a few left. This is a legume. And so that's kind of interesting. There are not that many, not that many trees that are legumes. And it's characteristic of this very smooth bark that you can see. This is another good way to tell. And of course the heart-shaped leaf is another good giveaway to it. Shiny, fairly shiny, and fairly heart-shaped.
So this is an American beautyberry, and it's drought and low water. It's just a drought tolerant plant. It can grow in shade, it can grow in sun, it can have lots of water, it can have hardly any water, and it just really seems to thrive. This plant was planted in the fall of 2018. There was like 4 sticks with no leaves, and I thought for sure it was going to die. So I kept really close attention on it, and in May of this year, this plant was so small that I was able to put this walkway in, and this is what happened over the summer. So the normal time to trim this back is in the winter when things die down. I don't want to cut any of those beautiful berries off, so I'll be shaping this up. Maybe I can get it to grow a little bit more upright. It can grow 3 to 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall, so I'm kind of hoping it covers up that electric meter soon, and I think we'll be able to do that. The berries on this bush are just absolutely gorgeous. It produces these beautiful purple berries, and everybody loves them. Cardinals love them, mockingbirds, finches, thrashers, quail. Lots of birds love these berries, so I'm looking forward to a big show in the fall with lots of different birds. Another important thing about this plant is it can handle just about any sort of water condition. You can put it with plants that need hardly any water or plants that need a lot of water. This plant can handle moist soil or dry soil. This is in my yard right here, it's not irrigated right over here, so you can see it's still got really big.
Here's a good example of autumn sage, often planted in clumps and not usually a single plant like this that's grown so large and mature, but it's pretty spectacular to see what they might look up if they ever got to be full size. And so here we go. It starts blooming in the early winter, and this one is still blooming even now in the heat of summer. It will probably improve in the fall as things get a little cooler. It's probably going to bloom even more and better. It is popular for hummingbirds and bumblebees, I don't know if you can pick it up in the video, but I'm actually here with a bumblebee that is sampling nectar from these flowers even as I talk. It's evergreen, easily found in nurseries, very, very popular, and in many varieties of color. This is just one. There's so many different varieties that you can find in the nurseries, or any sort of color to fit your taste and fit your needs. Here's several coral berries. This is a nice understory shrub. Does well in shade, and you can see it's doing quite well. We've got a mulberry, Texas mulberry on one side, and a Hercules club here on the other. That's kind of underneath both those trees, benefiting from that shade. It's not evergreen, so that people don't tend to use it too much as a planting. But in exchange for that, in the fall around Christmas time, you'll get very nice coral-colored berries, of which, of course, there are none left at this time of year. But you can see already where this fall's winter berries are going to be. These little clusters of green are going to grow out and be little clumps of nice coral-colored berries, hence the name. And it can be a nice splash of color in what would otherwise might be a dull winter. And it actually helps that the leaves have fallen off, because then the berries pop more.
Flame acanthus is one of many plants known as a hummingbird bush or a hummingbird plant, and for good reason. It has this wonderful tubular flower. Hummingbirds are known to come to red and orange flowers, and also, this tube is made exactly for them to nectar. It's a lovely plant with this kind of loose habit. You can train it up if you wish. I kind of like it to be loose and floppy like this, but it has a nice different kind of leaf shape to it, and it's a fun one to grow. You'll want to cut it back in the winter pretty severely, because it really springs back quickly in the spring and will bloom all the way till frost.
This is the Texas lantana. It's in the verbena family. It's in the same family as the vitex, and it's a beautiful plant. It has this multi-fluorescent flower. It has this nice citrusy smell. In the fall, it forms these little blackberries that the birds love. And the man who owns this plant was telling me he just loves this plant because it's always covered in butterflies when the butterflies come through. Now, the difference between this plant and the tropical lantana it's the one with the pink flowers. And that one is supposed to be susceptible to freezing. Now, the one at the bathhouse, we have several at the bathhouse, and we've had them for over 5 years, and we haven't had any problems with freeze back. If you want something that lasts a long time, I would look for this one. The man at North Haven Gardens, I went to buy this one, and then they didn't have it, but he said that the tropical one, he's had his in his yard for a long time as well, and it has not died back. According to the Aggie Horticulture webpage, they say this plant is one that you want to plant where your hose doesn't reach, because it doesn't need much water. It gets to be 4 to 5 feet tall and as wide as that. So it's a big, huge bush. You'll want to plant it where it can have plenty of room to expand and flower.
So here's a set of red yucca. Got red yucca down two sides of this little kind of inset between garage and the house here. Two different varieties of red yucca. This is the one that you'll find in the nurseries most commonly, and it looks almost identical to this one over here. This was actually a gift from someone at the Native Plant Society after one of our plant sales. Someone that didn't identify the name said, "Hey, for helping out, here's a red yucca, and it's the real deal." And I planted it years ago, and you can see it's doing quite well. It tends to be more branchy, a little more wild than this kind that you see in so many plantings, especially in commercial plantings. They're both blooming. They have nice coral flowers. Leaves are open. It's a good hummingbird plant, long blooming season. And on this one, you can see we've got green seed pods, so they haven't fully matured yet. They're very interesting to look at, and texture is interesting. And then over here on the other side, we've got some that are, of course, all nice and brown, and you can see they've started to open up, and we can even open one up and look at these seeds in here. Seem all nicely stacked, so they're kind of fun thing to deal with. And as near as I know, they're sterile. I've never been able to see them germinate. I hope that they can, and maybe there's just something about this particular situation in this yard that they don't like. But at any rate, an easily identified, very popular plant.
We have another wonderful plant for you, and this is called a black-eyed Susan. And you know, you look at this little plant and you're thinking, kind of a plain plant, nice little plant, but whatever. But let me give you the background here. We're outside on an August day. It's supposed to be over 100 degrees. It feels like it already is. And look at this little beauty. Not missing a beat here. This is a member of the sunflower family. It's drought tolerant. It's very easy to grow. It's not a long-lived plant, but it does reseed itself as long as you have it in open soil like this. These blooms will last quite a while. And if you're one of those gardeners who is okay taking a little extra care of something, if you deadhead it and water it just a little bit more, these blooms will last even longer. So it's a very good thing to have in your landscape. And there are just, I mean, I guess the easiest thing about it, or the best thing about it, are these beautiful pops of color. I mean, how could you miss this? I mean, these are just absolutely beautiful plants. The other wonderful thing about these little gorgeous plants is that pollinators are attracted to them, so they'll bring all sorts of bees, butterflies, and all those great things into your environment.
This is the Blackfoot daisy. It's an herbaceous perennial. It's in the sunflower family. It's heat and drought tolerant, and it's found on rocky slopes, and it needs good drainage. You can really kill this plant with kindness. If you give it too much water or you fertilize it too much, you may have a few more flowers for a short period of time, but then the plant will die. So you need to make sure that you give this guy a hard life. It grows in a low mound in the front of your bed, and it blooms starting in March, and it'll bloom all the way through to November. And when it stops blooming, it's a great opportunity to reshape it. You know, if it's gotten bigger than you want in the front of your bed, you might want to cut it back a little bit. And the Lady Bird Johnson website said that this seeds easily. We find that it stays in place. We haven't seen any babies when we weed out. And it's too bad because it's a beautiful plant and love to see more of them. The seed heads produce food for birds. They're wildlife, and it's a nectar source for pollinators. This plant is a butterfly weed, and I'm always surprised that it's called a weed because it's just so beautiful. It's native to the eastern and southwestern United States. It's heat and drought tolerant, and it's a perennial. The Lady Bird Johnson webpage says that it starts easily from seed, but we haven't done this one from seed. This is a plant we planted here. It's commonly known as butterfly weed because butterflies just love it. But it's a plant for lots of different insects. There's all kinds of bees and other different types of butterflies that love it. It's the larval host to queens and to monarchs. But of all the butterfly bushes, all the butterfly weeds, this has the least amount of the cardenolide, which is the poison that birds just hate. And it's the material in milkweed that protects the monarchs from birds. So it has the least amount of that material. But we still love it because it's, number one, gorgeous. Number two, it's it's loved by lots of different types of insects. Not only is this a beautiful color, it really sets off our rosemary really well. It brightens up that area of rosemary. And so the rosemary blooms in the early spring. We cut it back, and then we can showcase our beautiful butterfly weed. This is a fall aster. So this plant is another one of those heat and drought tolerant plants. It's an evergreen perennial, and it grows in the prairie sections of our state. It's a beautiful evergreen, and it stays green all year long. We in the wintertime cut it back to the woody portion of the plant in the winter, and then come June we cut it back again just so it stays mounded. And then it's pretty green. It just hangs there for all summer long. And then come fall, it produces these amazing purple flowers all over, not just one flower. The whole thing is covered with purple flowers. And every one of those flowers has a bee or a butterfly. It's just really a great plant because it comes at a time when everybody is packing it up for the summer. And this plant is really in its glory in the fall. So this is the four-nerved daisy. This plant is in the aster family, and it's like all the other plants that we've shown you. It's heat and drought tolerant. It grows in mounds, so you'd want to put it either in your rock garden or, as you see here, along the front of your bed because it grows in small mounds. So it's really the flower for all seasons. It blooms all year long, and if you keep it deadheaded, it puts out even more flowers. We drove to Joshua Tree National Forest in December this past year, and it lined the highways in Arizona and New Mexico. It's just beautiful. This big yellow pathway is really pretty. This plant attracts bees and butterflies. It's a source of nectar, especially in the winter when there's not much to go on. And as you see here, this seems to be the characteristic of it. It doesn't migrate into the good dirt. It seems to migrate toward the gravelly exterior.
Greg's mistflower is the famous butterfly plant. If we were here in October, this beautiful purple bloom would be covered with monarchs and queens and snouts and painted ladies and common buckeyes, as well as bees. It's a really fun plant. It has this really jazzy foliage that's light and frilly, and the purple blooms bloom profusely from early spring all the way to frost. It dies back in the winter, but it's a stellar plant all during the growing season. This area started off as one little 4-inch pot, and I had lots of other little 4-inch pots planted in this area, and the Greg's mistflower took over, but I haven't regretted it for a minute because it's so wonderful. And so that's just a cautionary tale that if you want to plant this, either have a space that you can really let it spread or be ready to discipline it. It's a stellar plant and you'll enjoy having it in your garden. So many of you have been lucky enough to hear Janet Smith's talk, Sex in the Garden. And one of the facts that she shares with us in that is that Greg's mistflower is known as the butterfly Viagra. It has an enzyme in it that is medicinal to the male butterfly, and the male butterfly can pass that medicinal value to the female when they mate. So in the fall you will see the male monarchs and queens on it, and that's a fun way for you to learn how to tell a male from a female. So you can practice looking at their wings and looking for the little spot that indicates that it's a male butterfly.
Here's a patch of cedar sage. They've stopped blooming this year. It's that hot time of August. They're pretty well done. They have very nice red flowers that really pop in a forest setting like this and as an understory planting. You can see they've done fairly well. They continue to kind of spread out, and in this case, they're between a juniper on the one hand and a red oak on the other, and just in some leaf litter on the side of our driveway into the house.
Mealy blue sage is a wonderful plant, especially if you want to learn about bees. This attracts bumblebees like nobody's business. It also attracts other native bees like carpenter bees. It has a wonderful airy habit, and it gets kind of tall, so it allows for you to plant in front of it, behind it. You can keep it confined to a small space, or if you wish, you can let it spread and fill in a nice area. It benefits from deadheading, so as the blooms die out, if you cut them back, it will continue to bloom for a long period of time. It starts off blue and it may phase over to the white phase. I have a little bit of both here, but this is a wonderful plant for bees and also for butterflies. I don't have a rock garden, but I do have a couple of spots that are just the out-of-way, terrible soil, hot sun, edge of the gardens places. Like this is on the edge of my alley. So Callilopus is a perfect choice for here or for your rock garden. I love the kind of ferny foliage that it has. It's a nice low-growing spreader, and it has a very cheerful bloom. If we were not in the heat of July, like if we were in spring or maybe in the fall, it would have profuse blooms. I can see a lot of little buds here. But it's cheerful, it takes almost no water. It's over here in the forgotten lands of my garden. So it can take the tough, the dry, the forgotten, and it's just a fun, different textured plant for you to have. Columbine is another showstopper plant that blooms in the shade. It's kind of too bad to be shooting this in the heat of July because it really performs best in early spring and maybe again in the fall. But somehow, just because you're a special class, this plant has mustered an out-of-season blossom just for you. In the spring, though, this bank is probably about this high, and it is covered with profuse blooms that you can see from blocks away. And it's just the most beautiful, showy plant, and because of the bright yellow, it shows up in the shade, and it's just delightful. Of course, one of the best things about columbine is this really unusual blossom that it has. It's stunning. But you can also grow it because the bees and the butterflies like it too. So it's a nice plant to have. It has interesting foliage. It will spread. I just have let this reseed, but it's not aggressive at all. It's easy to pull up if you get it where you don't want it. And it's a great plant to share with your buddies because it has lots of seeds and you can share it. But it's a wonderful shady plant. This is tough as nails. It has survived the droughts of 2011, 2012, 2013. I use very little supplemental water in my garden that has no sprinkler system. So I recommend columbine. Turk's cap is a really fun plant to grow. It has these wonderful big leaves. It fills in a big space. In fact, have space for it because it wants to spread, and be ready to discipline it because if it gets outside where you want it, it's really tough to dig out. I planted it back here, and I had planted columbine here, and now my Turk's cap has kind of spread around, but I'm not sure I object to that. So this is an example of Turk's cap in the shade, and you can see here it is blooming in the shade. And the columbine blooms with it, and it's just a lovely combination of the yellow and the red because the hummers love this plant, as do the bees and as do the butterflies. So Turk's cap in the shade is more of maybe a ground cover. It doesn't get really tall. You can see this is maybe 2 or 3 feet. In the sun, it can get 5 feet. In the great storms of 2019, you remember, with huge windstorms in the summer and a tornado in the fall, we lost a 60-year-old elm tree. So this used to be a shade garden. And the nice thing is I had Turk's cap in the shade. Well, now I have Turk's cap in the sun. So this has not yet reached its full height. It can get to be 5 or 6 feet, but it's doing really well adapting from its deep shade into the full blazing hot Texas sun. Turk's cap is wonderful too because it comes in with a white blossom and also a pink blossom. So you have your choice of red, white, or pink, and it's a great performer. It's a really versatile plant though, and it's one that's easy to grow and nice to have. Zexminia is another champion plant that I just love. It will bloom in the sun, it blooms in the shade, it fills in nicely, and I like the kind of loose habit that it has. If you give it a little haircut every now and again and take off the blooms, it will continue to bloom all the way from spring through frost. It's a good butterfly plant, and you can use it as a ground cover or as a specimen. It does spread, so but it's not really aggressive. So I let it fill in, which I just love because I don't have any grass. So I like things that act as ground cover, and I use Zexminia in that way. It's just a delightful, cheerful, blooming yellow plant.
All right, next we have little blue stem. It's a prairie grass. It's one of the big 4 prairie grasses, but it is the smallest of the 4. This plant has beautiful color year-round, and it's really a nice thing to add to your landscape. So this plant has an interesting history. It was originally brought in as food for cattle and livestock, and basically it's gone from the pasture to your front garden, because it's really just that pretty. This time of year, late summer, you have a very pretty blue-green color, and this will last most of through the rest of this year. It's looked like this since it first came out in March, so really nice summer color. The next thing that will happen is that the leaves start turning almost a red color, kind of a crimson red or a copper color, and they stay that color all during the winter, so it gives you some really nice color in your garden, which sometimes in the winter is really hard to obtain. This also has a very interesting seed pod. And as you can see, these are still just starting to come out on the plant. It looks nondescript at this point in time, but it gets to be a big, bushy, white, I guess a flower is the right word to say about it. Has lots of seeds, which the birds like. So it's really just an amazing thing to have in your garden and have all the seasonal differences. It's really good with that. It does reach about 3 foot tall by the time September rolls around, and basically what causes that growth, and I don't know how well you can see them on this particular plant, but it's actually these seed pods starting to grow out. It's very easy to take care of, tolerates a wide range of soils. The only thing about it, must have good sun and good drainage, minimal water needs, and once it's established, it can deal with drought and humidity. How many plants can do that? I'm sitting in a beautiful lawn of buffalo grass. Now, you may or may not have seen this before. It's actually been used, it's a perennial grass, but it's been used as turf grass since the 1930s. The great things about buffalo grass is that it's just a beautiful grass. It's very natural looking. It's just got a very nice flow to it. When the wind blows, you can actually see the grass moving. So it just is just a beautiful thing. It's very different than other types of grasses, other turf grasses like St. Augustine, which that of course requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of care, and a lot of water. This doesn't require any of those. It's very natural grass. The only issue that some people do have with it is that there are breaks in the grass. Like St. Augustine is a very dense type of grass, and weeds can't grow up through it. This is a little bit different. It's a lot more natural. natural, and you can get weeds in it, so you may have to do some weeding. It stays beautiful green during the spring and summer. It does turn brown in the fall when it goes dormant, but it comes back the following spring. Mowing this turf grass, you don't have to mow it at all if you don't want to. It will grow to a height of 6 to 8 inches, which sounds really long, but if you look at it, it very nicely kind of falls over, so you can't tell it's that long. If though you like a shorter type of lawn, you can cut it down to 2 to 3 inches. The best thing about this turf grass, though, is it attracts birds and butterflies, and that's certainly not something you can say about any other turf grass.
It's always nice to incorporate a few grasses in your landscape. It's nice to have this different texture and the movement of grass. This is Gulf muley or pink muley, and all the books will tell you to plant it on moss. And it really is lovely. If we were here in October, you would be able to see these nice pink plumes that top the grass when it's in bloom. So the bad news is, I'll confess that I didn't cut this back in the winter, so you see some of this brown. But the good news of that is that I didn't cut off last fall's blooms. So there aren't very many left, but at least you get some idea of the nice little fluffy plumage that it puts out. So in October, in an ideal situation with this plant, you would have a sea of this nice ephemeral, fluffy pink haze. And it's really a lovely plant. It's nice to grow in a front area like this, or it's also nice to tuck back kind of as a foundation plant or kind of an intermediate plant between low growers and then a bigger shrub behind it. So it's a wonderful texture and a nice plant to add to your landscape.
Here's an example of Lindheimer muley, kind of as a border planting along the edge of a driveway. So this is a really nice native grass. It does bloom, and we'll move to another plant that actually has a bloom on it here in August. But as you can see, it's a nice bunch grass, makes a good border. And one of the little interesting things about it that I found over the years is that it's, unlike a lot of native grasses, fairly tolerant of water. And so you don't have to worry too much about oversprinkling from your long grass that might be making a border with it instead of a driveway. It'll do quite well, unlike some other grasses, little blue stem that doesn't like a lot of water. And as you can see, it's doing pretty well here. It's underneath an eaves necklace, and so it can do well in shade, part shade and sun. So here's a Lindheimer muley that's in bloom. It has the stalk with a very nice spike of flower on it. It's as grasses go, it's got a pretty impressive flower head.
So this is Mexican feathergrass. It grows in the southwestern part of the United States in North America, and it also grows in the southern part of South America, and there's no natural or native population in between those two locations. This plant is heat and drought tolerant, and you don't want to over mulch it because it really likes dry feet. If you have too much mulch on it, it'll keep the roots too wet and you'll lose your grass. It can stand partial shade, that's why I have it planted here. And also, if you do plan to use this plant, put it in an area where you can see it move. That's the interesting, enjoyable thing about this. It moves in the wind, so it's a beautiful plant. High nitrogen can cause it to topple over. This plant has only been here for a couple of months. It'll get to be 2 to 3 feet tall, I'm hoping. It produces seeds that the birds love. It can produce, if we get a big thicket of it, it self-seeds. So if we get a big thicket of it, it's a good hiding place for wildlife, and the birds like the seed pods.
So if you ever wanted to learn about little things that fly around in your garden, get some frog fruit. Get a glass of iced tea and sit down next to it and just watch, because you will see all kinds of hoverflies and syrphid flies and tiny bees and all kinds of things that you never knew were in your yard. They love this delicate little bloom, and it's such a cheerful little bloom. I just love it. Frog fruit will take full sun. It will take some shade. It can be spread in a large area, or you can confine it. It's a wonderful ground cover, and it's just a cheerful, nice xeric plant to have in your garden.
Here's a patch of golden groundsel. This started out as about 3 plants that I put in about 5 years ago, and it's slowly spreading. Tends to be a spring bloomer, then usually again in the fall. Under really fabulous conditions, it will bloom from spring through the fall. I've seen examples of that. In this case, this patch is primarily spring and fall. But you can see it's nice and low. Could almost become a ground cover. And the flower stalks are going to be, say about that high, and covered with nice bright yellow flowers. So it's pretty impressive in the spring, one of the early ones to bloom. And you can see in this place, it's kind of competing with some American geranium that is quite aggressive, and I have to keep on a leash in order to help the golden groundsel continue to spread. This is coral honeysuckle. In this case, it's kind of a bushy form. It's not really climbing too much of anything. It's got really, really nice, large, tubular flowers that are, again, an early spring bloomer. Nice red, deep coral red. Again, popular for bumblebees. They might be at that time of year, and a few other pollinators like some hummingbirds. It's doesn't have any, it's bloomed already and the fruit have dropped off, but where the fruit would have been right here at the end, and they would have had two berries. Generally, wherever the flowers were, you might see the 2 little berries at the end of a stem. Here is the infamous poison ivy. You can see a fairly decent sized patch here. These are all small. We'll try to find some other examples in our yard. 3 leaflets, let it be. You know, poison ivy causes contact dermatitis in apes, of which in North America we're the only ape species here. Chimpanzees and gorillas are also bothered by it, but not too many, not anybody else. Poison ivy, you know, I tolerate it in my yard in places such as this, primarily because I'm interested in the wildscape aspects of it, and it supports over 30 species of bird. In the fall, the berries are very rich in fats, and so it's vital for birds as a source of energy in the fall as they're getting ready for winter or on migrations. And it helps bring a lot of animals into the yard, especially birds. So I tend to tolerate it. It's aggressive. It grows pretty rapidly, and the other trade-off, as I think about it in this yard, is, well, if it's aggressive and it takes a spot, then there's probably some alien species that it might be out competing, and I just need to be careful around it, which I work hard at doing that, at being careful around it. And we'll try to find some other examples here so you can see it in other forms. So here's an example. Again, it's still poison ivy, but now instead of close to the ground, we're looking at stuff that's 3 feet off the ground. It could get 5 feet off the ground. So it's kind of in its brush form here. And again, you can see the sets of 3 leaves. There are other plants that have 3 leaves that are not poison ivy and are quite safe. But it's a good indicator, and usually, as you can see here, there's some serration in the edges of the leaf. Sometimes it won't be that distinctive. Like here's a very mature leaf, and you can see it's not nearly as serrated, almost a smooth edge on that side. So you just have to be kind of constantly aware and careful when you're working around it about where it is and avoiding it. All right, here is Virginia creeper in actually two of its forms. Down here at my feet and spreading out, you see it as a ground cover. It's really good for covering shady areas underneath trees, as in this case. And it can also climb a tree, hence the name, like American climbing vine. Here it's climbing a very mature red oak in front of us. And when we go look closely at the leaf structure, you can see it has a set of 5 leaves, 5 and 5. Sometimes people confuse it with poison ivy, but this is a good sign in the time of year when leaves are out that it has 5 leaves instead of 3. And then the other telltale is that when you look at the vine itself, it doesn't have, these are relatively small, it doesn't have all those little kind of rootlets coming out, the little feet coming out like poison ivy does to help it adhere to the side of a tree. It's very smooth, as you can see there. Here's another example of Virginia creeper, American climbing vine, climbing something. In this case, the wall of our garage, which happens to have a stone face. You wouldn't want to have it climb a stucco wall because it would pull that stucco off. But as you can see, it doesn't have a lot of these little feet on it that you would often see on a poison ivy vine. So it's fairly clean, and that's another telltale that you're looking at a Virginia creeper and not a poison ivy, say in the wintertime when the leaves have fallen off.
This is one of the invasive species on your list. This is the honeysuckle. This is the japonica variety. It grows as a vine, as you can see. As you look around, it chokes out all our good plants. Now you say, so what's wrong with invasive species? You know, it produces berries to feed birds. It has beautiful flowers in the spring, just like this, just like the one that you can have in just like the bush shape. It has these beautiful yellow flowers in the spring that smell so nice. But the problem with invasives is that, number one, they outcompete our plants. And a lot of times they'll all bloom at one time. And insects and birds need to eat continuously through a season, not just once when they start blooming. And another problem is that although a number of insects are called generalists, but when they say generalists, that means maybe 2 or 3 other plants that are useful for them. So general doesn't apply to general, like we would think, all kinds of different types of plants. So that's another reason that we need to promote our native plant. And another thing too about this particular plant is that Doug Tallamy did a study in 2017. They looked for the content of the berries. It produces these black berries in the fall. And what he found was that the japonica variety, those berries had a lot less protein, which is good for the migrating birds and the overwintering birds. It has a lot more sugar. And according to Doug Tallamy, birds are just like us. You know we should be eating salad, but they prefer the sugary treat, so it's not good for birds either.
The next plant we have for you is Johnson grass. And as you probably know, this is not one of these nice Texas natives we want in our landscape. This plant instead came to us from Asia and North Africa. So definitely not something we want to have around. However, if you go anywhere in the state of Texas, you're likely to find this. It grows along the roadsides. It also grows in people's gardens. Typically, your neighbors will not be too happy with you if you do that, because this can spread by both seeds and rhizomes. So soon we may have little Johnson grass sprigs springing up everywhere. It was first brought to the United States as a forage for cattle, and something totally bizarre happened. It was introduced in around 1840 by Colonel William Johnson, hence Johnson grass. He planted it in his Alabama farmland, and obviously it did really, really well. Well, unfortunately, other people were not so happy about this, so this grass was the target of the first federal grant specifically for weed control in 1900. So things really haven't changed a whole lot in the preceding 100 years, I don't think, in terms of people liking this plant. Johnson grass itself, and you can't say that this is an ugly plant, because it's really not an ugly plant at all. It stands as tall as 6 to 7 feet. It has a very nice little seed head. Starts out rather small, and as it progresses through its life cycle, it gets larger in size. It starts off as almost a blonde color, and as the plant ages, it opens, spreads out, and turns almost to a purplish dark brown color. Now, the good news, it's very easy to identify. Many grasses, especially when they are not blooming, are really difficult to tell what they are. You have to be a real expert. You have to take lots of native landscape certification classes to learn this. But this one is really easy. There's this is just a blade, and this is any blade from the particular plant. It has a mid-vein in it, and it's a very beigey white color. You can't miss it. If you flip it over, you can feel it, and it's actually a sort of a rounded little edge of the stalk here. So those are really the easiest ways to identify it. If you do find this anywhere near your garden, your neighbor's garden, your wherever, pull it out. It's not necessarily really easy to get rid of. The easiest thing I think to do is as it keeps growing, just keep pulling it out. So even though it's not wonderful, it's definitely something we want to avoid at all costs.
Here is the infamous privet, one of our most common and persistent invasives. It's stopped blooming recently, and you can see it's starting to form the berries that are kind of sweet and birds enjoy. And they poop them out everywhere, spreading privet around. It's used in landscaping because it's evergreen and quite trainable. You can see it has the opposite leaves, which is its telltale sign, and they're very unlike the Yukon holly we showed earlier. See, it's very smooth edges on those leaves. These can get quite large, 20, 30 feet tall. They can come into trees. This one's still kind of in a shrub form, but if it went along long enough, it would tree up. And as you can see, it does really, really well in this environment. Even though it is an alien, it is very invasive.
The next thing we have for you is called a wax leaf ligustrum. There's a very nice sample of it here behind me. You'll see some very nice little berries on it, and you're probably asking yourself, what is wrong with this plant? Because this is on the invasive list. This is something we definitely don't want in our gardens. And to tell you a little bit more about the plant, it is an evergreen shrub. It grows about 2 feet per year, and with some age, it can easily be 20 to 30 feet tall. That's what's wrong with it. It can overshadow, overshade everything, so it's very difficult to get our good Texas natives to grow well underneath these types of trees. This is a typical branch of one. The leaves themselves are about 2 to 3 inches long. It does have sort of a waxy feel to the top of it, hence the name wax leaf ligustrum. The flip side of the leaf is almost a grayish green color to it. These will grow flower earlier in the year in the spring. They have small white flowers, attract a lot of pollinators. So you're probably thinking, what the heck is wrong with this particular plant? Those blossoms turn into berries, and this time of year they're very small and green. Later in the year, they ripen and they turn kind of a purplish black color. Birds love the berries when they turn the purplish black color. Of course, we all know what comes next. We know what birds do when they get full bellies. So you end up with these seeds being broadcast everywhere. The worst thing about this plant, though, is the fact that it grows very quickly and it grows very tall, especially in a neighborhood like this. If you live in an older neighborhood, they frequently use these types of shrubs in lieu of fences. So they were used for privacy, to mark property lines, that sort of thing. And many of these ligustrums are now 20, 30 feet tall. Nothing grows beneath them. It's very difficult because of the dense shade that they create. It's very difficult to get something to grow. So the best thing to do is to remove them from your landscape and then replace them with one of the good natives you're learning about today.